Hey guys, welcome back to Home Built, and this week we are back onto making some better engine mounts for the Alfarrari, and we're having a look at that exhaust again. All right, guys, welcome back. And yes, those who were watching, I am feeling much better than I was last week. I had a horrible cold and on the tail end of it. And yeah, definitely much more energetic this week. Thank you very much for all your comments and stuff on the last episode. If you missed it, I'll put a link up above so you can catch up. And like always, like and subscribe and do all that sort of stuff. It does help out that crazy algorithm. Last week, I mentioned, after pulling this out, that I was working on the engine mounts. Now, there were some people who, in the comments, still didn't quite understand the difference between a cross-plane crank and flat-plane crank, saying, "Oh, I've got a big engine and it doesn't vibrate at all." That's what a cross-plane crank engine does. It's designed to be smooth, and that's the reason why flat-plane crank engines are basically only used in the exotic cars, is because the flat-plane crank design is a fantastically light flywheel that will spin to the moon, so they rev very high. But the flip side of that is that they have a lot of inherent vibration. That is totally evident by the fact that I have the exact same engine mounts in two engines. One in the Rockster, the 4.2 litre Audi cross-plane crank V8, and this 3.6 litre flat-plane crank V8. The Rockster's smooth as silk, not a problem. In this, it's basically just vibrating the entire chassis of the car. It's just that this is a very vibration-heavy engine. As far as the sound goes, there's lots of suggestions on that, and we'll get onto that stuff when we start tackling the exhaust later in the video. But to start with today, I want to get onto a couple of really good suggestions about the gearbox, and particularly about my shifter jumping out of gear. All right, so last week I was talking about how the gearbox was jumping out of gear, particularly in the third and fourth, so the central plane of the shifter movement. And there was a couple of really good suggestions that I didn't actually know about. I was picturing that basically it's parts internally in the gearbox, which basically means you've got to pull the whole thing apart and rebuild it, which is a lot of work. And these are not crazy expensive, so it's potentially easier to just get another second-hand box. But there are a couple of serviceable springs that there's actually upgrades available for in this that work with the shifter. Now, after doing research online, there are two springs in here. There's a spring on the opposite side of the gearbox here that I believe helps center the gear stick, so that you can upgrade it and get extra force to bring it back to center, so that if you're shifting from second to third, you can almost just sort of push the gear stick straight up, and the spring will take it over and just help speed up the potential of shifting. And there's another one on this side. Now, at first I thought they might be, one spring for one side and one spring for the other, which it could be the case. But I believe that the one on this side has a detent ball on the end. And I'm hoping that this one could just be a little bit slack, a little bit soft, and it's not holding the shifter in the detent as strongly. So if I increase the pressure of this spring, I might be able to help my problem. So let's take this off and see what we're working with. All right, so I pulled out the side that I knew had a detent ball in it, and you can see here it's got a little detent in it. And inside here there is a spring that they replace and upgrade to try and get a little bit more pressure in there. Unfortunately, after having a look at what this actually does, this is just the detent is to help keep the stick in the center plane. All right, so I pulled the spring out of the opposite side, and interestingly, I can't get anything inside to move. Shifting still seems to be exactly the same. There's nothing happening here. So I'm wondering whether there's actually something in here that's seized. So maybe down the end of this hole, it is that little cap is locked in. So I'm going to spray a bit of carby cleaner and stuff in there now and see if I can try and get it to move. So I'm using a punch now that's roughly the size of the cap that is inside this piece. Now, the cap is supposed to be removable, but it doesn't want to come out. So I've definitely found my issue. This spring goes in this hole and it was not doing anything. The little cap in the bottom of this was not moving at all. And now I've noticed if I've got a punch that's about the size of that hole, and you can see the shift is just as loose as it always was. But if I get it, particularly get it out close to being in gear, not quite in gear, and I actually tap this down, it will actually move the shifter out and detent the shifter in place. And I don't know if you saw that, this actually moved out and that's actually now in place. And now to actually get it out of gear takes quite a bit more force. But once it's out, that little piece has moved up and it's stuck up. So I can only get about 1 millimetre or so of movement at the moment. I've put penetrating oil in there, and basically what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to, I'm tapping it down, moving the shifter, lifting it back up again, and just trying to get that movement to free it up to get it to work and do what it's supposed to do. So I moved this cap backwards and forwards in this little slot for an hour probably, and it's still definitely not coming out, but I at least freed it up, and then I managed to reassemble. All right, I was due a win. So after a whole lot of tapping that little cap in with a punch, I couldn't get it to actually come out, but I've actually freed it up. Basically what I had to do was I'd put it in gear, I'd tap the little cap in, and then pull it into the next gear, and by pulling it into the gear, it goes in and out of the detent, so it pushes that little cap back, and then knock it back in again, put it back into gear, backwards and forwards. I would have done it 150 times. But it now works. That is in fourth, and it takes quite a bit to get it to change. Actually, it's hard to get it to go into neutral. It wants to go all the way up to third, but then it takes quite a bit to get it to come back out. Like I can feel there's detents there now where there wasn't detents before. It is actually going to shift. That has fixed my problem. I can't believe it was that simple. The rest of the gearbox, all the gears seem to work. Nothing seems to whine, although not that you'd really hear it in this car. But yeah, I think that is a win and a very simple one. So we can move on to engine mounts. All right, let's pick up where we left off last week and move on over to the engine mounts. Now, there was lots of discussions about the engine mounts. Like I mentioned, the engine does need to move quite a bit. Now, the gearbox mounts are really, really loose. So there's a few people who mentioned that I have to watch them as well. And they're already the factory BRZ ones, and there's actually quite a lot of movement in them. So they're still going to have way more give than my new engine mounts are going to. I need to remove these polyurethane bushings and replace them with these much larger. They are from a 79 series Land Cruiser leaf springs, so they're much larger and pure rubber rather than being polyurethane, so they should absorb a lot more of the vibration. I'm almost certain it's not going to absorb everything. It's not going to be super smooth. There's still going to be some vibration, but hopefully it's a lot less than what it was. Now, last week I got on the lathe, I got the piece of steam pipe, and I've turned down my first center. And as I mentioned, these bushings are wider together than what the Triton ones are, but I don't want to modify the car side of the mount. So I've made a nice narrow piece of pipe, and I'm just going to have to cut these down to make them a bit narrower to fit in. If they're a little bit short in the middle, that's also not a bad thing. The less rubber here, the more they'll be able to move and absorb the vibration. Somebody did mention they had something similar and drilled out the polyurethane ones and just put drill holes through it to basically softened them and been running that for years. I did consider that, but I think this will be a better option. Now, to get the engine mounts in the exact same spot, I need to make a jig with this engine mount. Now, I looked at just using the bolt holes to bolt it on, but the bolt holes aren't going to be perfectly tight, and there's a tiny bit of slop, and particularly on this car where a millimetre either way is a lot because we have so little room. What I've got to do is, instead of having it bolt on, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to use this big block here I've got, and I'm going to weld in some fences so that I can sort of plonk this into place, and then weld in a couple of tabs where I can bolt in through the center here. So I've got the exact location of where the current base sits and the current bolts sit. Then I can cut it off, mount my new ones into that spot, weld it up, and they'll be in the exact same spot. So let's start doing that.
So I start out cutting a couple of little pieces of angle iron so that I can start welding up the fences for the base of my engine mount jig. So I firmly weld in the base brackets of the jig, and then it's time to start making some clearance to make the through bolt section. And for this, I'm using some slightly larger angle iron so that I can fit the large bolt through it. It's an M14 bolt. Trim it up and get it roughly in shape, and then drill the holes so then I can bolt it all together on the old mount, and then I can weld that into place so then I have locked in the location of the through bolt in relation to the base. Then it's a matter of unbolting it, and I couldn't get it out. I had to actually cut some of the fence down at the back, but still left enough room, and now I can weld it up solid so I have my full jig.
All right, so that is my completed engine mount jig. So you can sort of see here, it looks a bit of an odd contraption, but basically, if I take the bolt out and lift it up, I can slide this out, and this will only go into the exact spot each time. It's quite a sort of tight fit in there. That sits in place, and then the bolt goes back in. So I know that this is a repeatable engine mount location. So if I cut this bit off and make my new mount with my new bushings to bolt into the same spot, and then weld this the tube to the base in this location, the engine will not move at all, and it'll go back in the exact same spot. All right, so I knocked out the crush tube from the old mounts, and this is a much thicker wall than what the current bushings will take. Basically, this is just a crush tube to stop you from bolting it in too tight and crushing it. So it's much thicker than it needs to be with an M14 bolt through. The M14 bolt is actually what's sort of holding everything in. This, as I said, is just a crush tube, so I'm going to turn this down on the lathe so it fits in there. There's still be plenty of meat on it to do its job, so let's do that.
So onto the lathe, and this was actually quite difficult to turn down because it's stainless steel, so it took quite a few passes, but at least it's going to be super strong.
All right, so I've turned down my crush tube, still plenty thick, still probably 1.5 mil thick wall, which is more than enough for what I need, and now it fits inside of my my other bushings, so that's a nice good tight fit. Now I need to work out how to trim down this rubber and get this so that I can fit 2 bushings in here nice and snug.
I do a bit of a measurement to try and work out how much I need to take off these bushings, and then using the calipers I actually sort of score around the outside of the rubber and use that as a guide to go through with the blade and just cut off the ends of the bushings. So when I went to assemble them, I was having a lot of trouble getting both bushings all the way in and snug. I stupidly installed the crush tube into one of the bushings and then tried to squeeze the other bushing in, which obviously made an airlock in the middle. Bushings first, then crush tube last.
All right, so I've got the new bushing block. It fits into my jig. It matches in with what was here. So now we need to cut this one off and weld this one on in the jig.
So I very quickly discarded the thought of trying to press these old bushings out. I'm just going to throw them anyway, so I just cut the entire tube off of the top. And the new tube is larger than the old one, so I've got a fair bit of extra meat to work with there. I start using my roll cage tube notching experience to join these two up and make the basic mount, tack it into place, and then I've pulled the bushings out so I don't melt them, and I'm welding it off of the jig. I could have made up some metal bushings to go in place, but that seemed like a lot of work for the slight chance of any warping, and it goes back in the jig fine.
We have the engine mount all looking beautiful and ready to roll. And just to confirm, let's make sure it fits back in the jig now that it's all welded together and held there. And we can stick the bolt in. That means we have a perfect engine mount exactly like the old one, but now hopefully with a bit more give. All right, so one down, but the mounts are not symmetrical, so we have to break this down and make another jig to fit the second mount. So let's do that.
So first thing is I start cutting off the old jig, but I'm going to reuse all of the pieces to try and save me some time. I set up all the fences and tack them into place as I did last time, but this time the center cotton reel mount is offset a lot more than the other one, so it takes a little bit more tweaking to get it in the correct spot, but it's not too difficult. And then it's on to trimming down the bushes and making the center section of the new mount. Cut off the old one, do a bit of alignment, and then tack the new mount into place. Disassemble and weld it all up, and we have a very nice finished mount. Then I disassembled the first one I made as well, so we can clean them up and give them a coat of paint.
All right, so let's move on to the next challenge. Now, one of the things that I have mentioned before many times is that this does not sound like a Ferrari in this package. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with my headers. So there were a bunch of suggestions in the previous episode. There were a bunch of people saying that because I've changed the induction path, the inlet, that it will change the sound of the car. It will change the induction noise somewhat, definitely, but the exhaust note, which is what I'm chasing, almost nothing. Like the amount of change in the inlet is almost insignificant to the exhaust note, and that I don't think is my issue. My main issue is these. So these are the headers that I made up when I was doing this build to get them to fit into the car. As you saw last week with the scans of the engine bay, that it is extremely tight in the engine bay, and this is what I had to do to make them fit. Now, this is the original Ferrari header. Now, this is obviously much bigger. It takes up so much more space than the ones that I made up, and there is zero chance of these fitting in the car. Now, these are reasonably equal length from what I understand, and these in this car are 4-to-1 headers. So basically all 4 of these tubes go to one outlet, one collector and then outlet. In the 430, so the next edition, it's a different engine, and they go from 4 to 2 to 1. So they have 4-to-1 headers. These are 4-to-1, if that makes sense. So these can sound really good with a good exhaust. They can sound really good. The muffler, the back is a big part of it, and that's going to be a big part of my car. And it will vary, and there's lots of things I can do on the part beyond the headers, and I'll still experiment with that later. The difficult thing to change is this. And the issue I have at the moment is that it's not an even sound out of this car because these header lengths are so vastly different. You can see that we have the longest header from the front is vastly longer than the shortest header from the back. So even though these pulses are all even, they're all getting to here out of phase and at different times. Whereas if they were even, when each of these fire, they take the same amount of time to reach the collector. So you get that even sound. 1, 2, 3, 4 here means 1, 2, 3, 4 here. And that is basically what I am trying to chase, is get that even note, and then I can work on the tone later. Sound is part of it. There is also power. To be honest, I'm mostly interested in the sound, but there is power benefits for getting the exhaust right. Obviously, you open things up, there's less back pressure, there is, it is a way of freeing up the engine to make more power. But sometimes that can just make it loud, and sometimes it can help. Now, one of the things that I have come aware of recently, Adam LZ did a video on building an exhaust to try and make it sound better on a 12 rotor, and somebody brought up that one of the things that you need to do is make sure that when the pulses come to the collector, they all hit the collector and it fires in a circle. So in this case, in the Ferrari's case, the firing order works out that it's inside to outside, inside to outside, inside, outside, inside, outside. So basically what I worked out is that as long as collector 1 and collector 4 are diagonally opposite in the merge collector, then it will be traveling in a circle, one way or the other. It doesn't really matter which way the other two are. It doesn't matter whether it's clockwise or anti-clockwise. It's just more that each being next to each other will create a vortex and also sort of add to the scavenging effect and help the exhaust come out. And I did notice, I actually looked at FabSpeed, have a video on pulling the collectors apart, and Ferrari have done this. So Ferrari collector goes in a circle, and FabSpeed's ones don't. They actually crisscross, and you can hear the difference in the FabSpeed header to the factory header. FabSpeeds are louder, and they may make more power, and I don't know anything of that, but I don't like the sound of that as much. I think the sound is much smoother when they are in a circle and they all flow together. So that is one of the points I'm looking at. There's another YouTube channel, MySteer, who's been doing a lot of research into trying to get that Formula One high-pitched sound, which I would love to get, but cross one bridge at a time. Another one of his suggestions that apparently the F1 cars started doing in the late 80s is halfway along each runner, they step up in size, and apparently it's something to do with the sound waves as they travel along. When they hit an opening, they send a pulse backwards and some of the pulse forwards, and that changes the sound. And so they travel along at one small size, step up slightly, and then continue on. I'll incorporate that if I can, but to be honest, you can just with a good muffler on a factory Ferrari 360 and these headers, you can get these to sound really good. The Capristo exhausts, particularly on a 355, I think is one of the best sounding V8s there is. Fight me in the comments, but I think that's ultimately what I would like. And you can get a similar sound with the Capristo exhaust on the 360. So that's the ultimate, that's what I'd love to get, but we'll just work towards getting an even note, because at the moment the sound is all uneven due to this. So we need to make these equal length. So like I showed last week, I did the scans of the engine bay, and there was a bunch of you who reached out to me to get copies of those scans to try and make equal length headers with the space I have. And I'm gonna have a go myself, but my CAD skills are average, and trying to get to that level of detail is quite difficult to learn, and I'm not there yet. So what I did look at was basically the Lego type blocks that you can mock up headers with. I've looked in the past, they're really expensive and they're limited in the sizes they come. Like some of the brands don't even do 1.5 inch headers, which is what these are. A lot of them start at 1 5/8 and go bigger than that, so they don't make them small enough. And also, they don't necessarily make them tight enough. And then I got to thinking, they're made out of plastic. I wonder if somebody has already made a file of them that I can just print out. And I did a search on Thingiverse, and Xeon Designs, I think, had already made some that are just ready to go. And these are free to download on Thingiverse, and I've just downloaded them, and they just clip together, and you can do these for mock-up. But the issue I have is that, again, they don't necessarily make them tight enough. Now I know that everything is very tight on this engine bay, and I might need tighter radiuses than this. I mean, this is what I've currently got, this tube, which is similar to what I've got on the out of the black here, but I actually redesigned them and I made up some donut mock-up. So this is 16 parts at 25 degrees each. So I've got a bunch of these pieces that I'm going to try and see if I can do a bit of a freehand mock-up using these. So for this mock-up tee, I'm going to use a piece I cut out on my plasma table. So this is going to be the backing, and then I've got, this is going to be my collector that my pieces actually clip into. So I will have a 4-to-1 collector here, and I can clip all 4 headers into this, and it doesn't really matter what happens from the collector on. I'm just looking to get the headers at this front section. So let's make up a bit of a jig using this cutout and this piece to get them in the same location as this, and then I can try and mock them up in physical space.
So using the original header, I use my mock-up base plate to roughly work out the angle of where the collector needs to be and put a fold in it, and then bolting it on, I then try and mock up my actual collector plate in the exact same spot so I can get a jig of the working headers.
All right, so here we have a mock-up of where my header needs to go. So this collector is in the exact same spot in relation to the header outlets as the original. So I've got my jig. I need to now start taking some of these plastic bits and making them join up to here.
So I begin by bolting on the header flange that I printed out a week or so ago that I know fits, and then using that I then start trying to mock up the headers in space, using the original as a bit of a guide so that I can get it pretty close, because I know there are a few places where they only just fit, so I need to keep that in mind while trying to make equal length headers of the rest, and it's not that easy.
All right, that was a lot of time playing around, and I'm not sure it's actually going to work, but I think this is about as close as I can get to an equal length header situation. So basically I went through beforehand and I measured up these black pieces, and this straight is 1 inch long, and one of the 25 degree curves, that is also averages out at 25 millimeters long, or an inch long. So they're 25 millimeters each for those, and for these grey ones that I made up, these are 15 millimeters of linear travel. So I worked out that my longest runner is 365 millimeters. So I had to add up the tight curves and the looser curves with the black together, and counted up the number of pieces in each runner to make sure that they are all bang on 365 millimeters. Now, most equal length runners are not 100% equal. They just need to be relatively close within a small margin.
So I kind of thought that these were close. I would scan them and see if I could work with them in CAD, but after looking at it, it's really not going to help me much. I think there's a much quicker, simpler option of seeing how they fit.
What I should have actually done first is take this very fragile, flimsy model and actually mock it up to the engine, and I can already see that this runner down here interferes down here, so that is not going to work. So that, for starters, needs some reworking.
I'm definitely starting to see the benefit of these little Lego pieces.
So I tried my model again, so I kept the longer two runners. This one is a little bit troublesome. I think this is going to interfere with things, but at this stage that's less of the issue. Now this runner, instead of looping around in this way, I looped it around the other runner here, and this part here now interferes with the engine mount. So there is a lot of work that needs to go into this, and again, I don't think this is going to do the job. So I've already spent several hours on this, mocking this up, and even as it is, it really doesn't look like at this stage it could work in this configuration. I might be able to move the collector further down, but a lot of this is stuff that really would be better designed in CAD. I'm really struggling with this at this stage, so I think we're going to leave this here with the plastic mock-ups. It was worth doing it. It was a lot of time on the printer. All right, so I've spent several hours on this now, and at least in the current configuration, I really don't see it working easily. There's a lot of these bends that are really tight, and there's so little room to work, and to try and get it equal length, extending all of the short runners is really a lot more difficult than it first appears. Now, I possibly could try and extend the collector a little bit further down the exhaust, so instead of it collecting here, it could collect sort of here. That may help things a bit and give me a little bit more room to sort of run things and make the runners a little bit longer. I'll have a look at that, but that's probably something I need to do in CAD. I don't particularly want to spend ages making these up, bolting them on the engine, and then trying to drop the engine in and out of the engine bay all the time. Everything's all neat and tidy in there, and every time I put it in and out, I'm risking scratching it and damaging it and making myself more work to do later. So at this stage, we'll leave it to the guys who are playing around with the CAD. I'm going to play around with it myself in CAD off camera. But for now, I think there's one more little job that I want to tackle on the Alfa. So another thing that's been annoying me on the Alfa is that the brake light switch doesn't always disengage. Now on this car, it has a pressure switch in the line of the brake fluid, and for some reason it works, the brakes come on, but it doesn't always come off. When it was tested and when it was first done, it seemed to be working okay, and now it just seems to not come off unless you sort of stab on the brake and then really lift off quickly. It seems to leave the brake lights on, which is annoying, not safe, and yeah, it's definitely not something I want on this car. I don't want somebody running up the back of me because I can't see that I'm braking because the brake lights are always on. So what I did is I went to a wrecker. I got a brake light switch off of a wrecked car. I can't even remember what car this was, but they're all roughly the same. These things are super reliable and much better than the pressure switch that's in this thing. So I've already got it wired up. All I really need to do is just mount this up.
So once I work out roughly where I'm going to put it, I need to start making up a bracket. So drilling out a hole roughly the size of what I need, and I found to make the shape for the clip, it's easier to just use a hand file it into shape, and once I'm happy with that, I can then fold up a couple of bends in it to make it a nice strong little shape, weld up the corner, give it some paint, and screw it into the location.
Well, that's totally frustrating. I went to all the effort of mounting the switch in. Everything is ready to go. And for some reason, this brake switch is completely opposite to every other brake switch. Most brake switches are set up so that when you release it, it turns the lights on. That's how it's designed. This one, it connects the circuit when you press it. This is normally open, and it should be a normally closed switch. And it's not, and it's really, so this is not going to work. My brake lights are going to come on when I'm not on the brakes, and when I am on the brakes, they're going to turn off. That's dumb. All right, so we've had some great success this week fixing this gearbox so that it actually is going to stay in gear. Is such a relief. I was thinking I had to rebuild the gearbox or go and buy another gearbox, or this is just such a simple fix, and it was free. That is amazing. So I am very happy about that. We have engine mounts that should fit and should put the engine in its correct place and hopefully not vibrate too much. We'll see how that goes. And yeah, we're working away on the header design, but there's lots of things to think about. And like you saw with me trying to mock it up, there is just not much space. So I'll be working more on that in the background, but that is all the time we have this week. So I think that means it's time for Fun Facts with Mrs. Jeff.
Hey guys, after Ferrari's strange experiment with a 2-cylinder engine in the 50s, they tried again in the 90s building a 3-cylinder engine. The Tipo F134 was an experimental 2-stroke 3-cylinder engine that Ferrari developed in 1994. It was designed to be half of a V6 and looked at a lot of the shortcomings of a 2-stroke engine and aimed to improve on them. It featured a wet sump to handle lubrication to avoid the oil-fuel mix normally used in 2-strokes. This was to help with emissions. Also did away with carburetors in favour of a dual port injection and even used cam-driven exhaust valves like a 4-stroke. Now 2-strokes are known for a lack of low-end torque, so Ferrari added a supercharger. Despite all of this work, it only made around 160 horsepower from its 1.3 litre capacity. So the 2-stroke concept was scrapped by Ferrari.
All right, another week down. The engine is still not back in, but I'm happy to take my time and do everything nicely. I was trying to race it back in to get it ready for the Cars and Coffee that was a week or so ago, and I missed that anyway, so there's no screaming hurry. I want to get it right before I put it back in.
Ooh, this is different to your normal approach.
But I'm sure it's going to go back in with these old headers and then come out again to put the new headers in. So I won't have the new headers made in time, but we'll at least see how these engine mounts go. And if they don't work well, then I know that I can change them again and see if I can get something softer again. But I need to have enough room for the engine to move. So there's catch-22 then.
Yeah, all right, well, like, subscribe, usual things. Let Jeff know what you think. Of course, Patreon if you want to help him out and see the videos a day early with no ads. And I think that's everything.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
See you soon. Bye.
See you guys.
This was to help with emissions. It also did away with, damn it, this is hard. This was to help emissions. It also did away with This was to help emissions. It also did away with carburetors. And even used a cam-driven master stroke to help with the valves. Cam-driven exhaust valves. 2 superchargers? Super dragons? What's that word?
Superchargers.